The black maw hung in the void like a gaping wound, an ancient fortress station orbiting a long-dead planet. It had no allegiance to any empire, no loyalty beyond profit and power. The syndicates called it neutral ground, but neutrality was a lie. The only law here was the will of the strongest, and tonight, the strongest had gathered. In the heart of the station, beneath the glimmer of low-burning chandeliers and the sharp tang of alien spice, a dozen crime lords sat in a great obsidian hall. They were the architects of the galactic underworld. Zelter smugglers, Graxian bounty clans, cybernetic slavers from the Orion Divide. Some had spilled oceans of blood to be here. Others had simply bought their way in. But all of them shared one certainty. Nothing in the galaxy could touch them. At the head of the room, Jervek the Red leaned back in his throne of fused bones, talons drumming lazily against the armrest. His species, the Vorzul, were known for their appetite for destruction, but Jervek had taken it further than most. His empire stretched across a dozen systems, his fleets raiding colonies, his mercenaries butchering any resistance. He had made examples of human settlements before. Whole families wiped out, soldiers impaled on their own rifles, cities burned until only cinders remained. The humans had sent warnings, threats from their distant core worlds, but no fleet had come. No armies. No assassins in the night. Nothing. Jervek sneered, raising a crystalline goblet filled with something dark and viscous. "This galaxy fears us," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "We sit here unchallenged, while the so-called empires bicker and rot. No one dares." The great doors of the hall groaned open. The conversation died instantly. A single figure stepped inside. At first, there was confusion. The being was tall, perhaps as tall as a Graxian hunter, but lean, clad in black, his movements slow and deliberate. He carried no visible weapon, wore no armor, yet the room shifted as if an invisible predator had entered their midst. The air thickened. The guards stationed along the walls straightened, hands inching toward their weapons. Then came realization. Human. The word rippled through the room in a dozen languages, some hushed, others scoffing. The crime lords had seen humans before. Traders, mercenaries, desperate refugees looking for transport. They were scattered, numerous, ambitious in their small way. But in this room, in this place, they were nothing. And yet, this one walked as if he were something else. The door sealed shut behind him. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of energy shields embedded in the walls. The human came to a stop at the center of the chamber, his gaze sweeping across the room. His eyes, pale, glacial, settled on Jervek last. The Vorzul warlord leaned forward, amusement flickering behind his burning irises. "You are very, very lost, little primate." The human didn't respond. He studied the warlord for a moment longer, then shifted his gaze to the others. Nathan Kane had never been a man of many words. Words were for politicians, for leaders who fought wars with speeches and treaties. He had no patience for that. Instead, he let the silence linger, let the weight of his presence seep into the cracks of their confidence. One of the Zelter, a reptilian brute with bioluminescent scars, clicked his mandibles in irritation. "What is this?" he hissed. "A pet? A slave someone lost?" A few in the room chuckled. Kane finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, but it cut through the air like a blade. "You killed the wrong people." The laughter stopped. Jervek's amusement remained, though it was tinged now with something else. "Is that so?" Kane's gaze didn't waver. "A month ago, a freighter passed through Sector 12. No cargo, just civilians. You raided it, tore it apart. No survivors." The warlord tilted his head, feigning thought. Then he smiled, his jagged teeth gleaming. "Ah, yes. A Terran ship, was it?" They screamed so sweetly. He swirled the liquid in his goblet. "Let me guess. You lost someone?" Kane didn't answer. He didn't need to. The Graxian bounty lord, an enormous wolf-like creature with cybernetic arms, exhaled sharply. "This is a waste of time," he growled. "Kill him and be done with it." Zhervek nodded lazily, waving a clawed hand. "Yes, remove him." The guards moved in. Kane exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing. They had no idea. The first came at him too casually, reaching for his shoulder, expecting compliance. Kane stepped sideways, pivoted, and drove a rigid hand into the alien's throat. The guard crumpled, choking, before Kane twisted, catching another by the wrist and wrenching his arm out of its socket. The scream that followed was wet, animalistic. Then the real killing began. Kane exploded into motion. His movements were precise, ruthless. Trained reflex honed over decades. He ducked under a wild swing, drove his elbow into a ribcage, snatched a falling sidearm from a dead guard's belt. A single shot, clean and efficient, dropped another before they could react. The syndicate leaders recoiled, their smug certainty shattering. The Graxian bounty lord surged from his seat, drawing a massive plasma blade. But Kane was faster. He twisted, fired twice, one shot to the eye, the other into the throat. The bounty lord collapsed, twitching, claws scrabbling against the floor before going still. Zhervek rose slowly. The amusement was gone. Kane flicked the cooling barrel of the stolen pistol toward him, his expression unchanged. Not so untouchable after all. The warlord's gaze darkened. The other crime lords had already begun edging toward the exits, their arrogance crumbling under the realization of what was unfolding. Their guards, their security, none of it had been enough. Kane tilted his head, scanning the room. There were still many left. That was fine. He had time. The bodies were still cooling, wisps of acrid smoke curling from the wounds Kane had inflicted. The grand obsidian hall, once filled with laughter and indulgence, now stank of charred flesh and something heavier, the unmistakable scent of fear. The surviving crime lords, some still seated, others halfway to the exits, stared at the human who had just dismantled their guards as if he were peeling fruit. Zhervek the Red did not flinch. His massive frame, draped in dark ceremonial armor, remained still, but his eyes burned with something unreadable. The Vorzul warlord had spent centuries carving his way to power, had stood unshaken against assassins, fleets, planetary bombardments. Yet now, watching the lone human amid the wreckage of his men, a realization settled over him, slow and insidious. Kane had not come to talk. He had not come to threaten. He had come to kill. And he was not finished. One of the remaining syndicate leaders, a Zelter enforcer covered in ritual scars, hissed in disbelief. His four-fingered hand hovered over his belt, where a compact plasma caster was holstered. This is madness. His voice was sharp, unsteady. You think you can walk into our den and slaughter us like cattle? Kane's response was a slow, deliberate step forward. The movement alone sent a ripple of unease through the room. The Zelter's fingers twitched, but Kane's voice cut through the space like a blade. Try it. The alien hesitated. Zhervek leaned forward, his claws drumming against his throne's armrest once more. The amusement had returned to his face, but it was different now, forced. A warrior, then one with a vendetta. Let me guess, a soldier? Special forces? Kane said nothing. The warlord chuckled, a low, grinding sound. I know your kind. I have broken your kind. He gestured toward one of the corpses, its lifeless eyes still open. You fight well, but you are still just a man. You bleed. You tire. You are outnumbered. Kane studied him, then scanned the remaining figures in the room. None of them were soldiers. They were killers, yes. Smugglers, warlords, slavers. But they fought with numbers, with hired guns, with the assurance that no one would ever challenge them. They had ruled through fear for so long they had forgotten what it meant to face something that did not fear them in return. I don't care, Kane said simply. Zhervek's smile thinned. A low chime echoed through the room, a barely perceptible shift in the station's ambient hum. Somewhere unseen, locks disengaged. Reinforcements. Kane's jaw flexed. He had expected this. A heavy door at the far end of the hall hissed open, and the sound of armored boots striking the floor filled the chamber. More guards, better trained, better armed. They wore the insignia of Gervec's elite enforcers, their polished exo-armor gleaming beneath the dim lights. Some carried shock batons, others plasma rifles, all of them radiating the lethal confidence of men who had never known true failure. The lead enforcer, a towering cybernetically augmented brute, studied the scene, taking in the bodies, the smoking weapons, the standing crime lords whose terror was beginning to seep through their attempts at composure. His gaze locked onto Kane. "So," the enforcer rumbled, his voice modulated through his helmet speakers. "This is the one." Gervec nodded. "Kill him." Kane moved first. He pivoted sharply, driving a boot into the nearest overturned table. The heavy obsidian slab flipped, slamming into the nearest enforcer with bone-crushing force. Kane seized the distraction, ripping a plasma sidearm from one of the fallen guards and firing in rapid succession. 2 shots, 2 kills. The remaining enforcers responded with trained efficiency, fanning out, opening fire. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, searing into walls, vaporizing the edges of furniture. Kane ducked low, weaving through the chaos, his stolen weapon hissing with every precise pull of the trigger. One enforcer lunged, swinging a shock baton, but Kane caught the attack mid-motion, twisted, and used the alien's own momentum to drive him into the floor. The sound of vertebrae snapping was lost beneath the gunfire. A shot grazed Kane's shoulder, heat searing through fabric and flesh. He ignored it, grabbed the fallen enforcer's rifle, and in a single fluid motion, spun and fired 3 bursts, center mass. The attacker dropped, twitching, smoke rising from the craters in his chest. The enforcers hesitated now. Kane wasn't just fast. He wasn't just strong. He was efficient. And efficiency, in the face of fear, was horrifying. One of the remaining enforcers took a cautious step back. Another, despite his augmentation, hesitated. The tide was shifting, the room beginning to understand what it was dealing with. Gervec saw it too. The warlord rose to his full height, his imposing frame towering over the others. Enough. The enforcers froze. Kane didn't. He kept his rifle trained, breathing steady, gauging the warlord. Gervec's crimson eyes gleamed with something new. Not amusement, not irritation, curiosity. "You are not just a soldier," the warlord mused. "Not just a man seeking vengeance." "No! I see it now." He stepped forward, his talons clicking against the polished floor. "You are something else." Kane said nothing. Gervec's lips curled, his head tilting ever so slightly. "Tell me, human, how many of my kind have you killed?" Kane met his gaze cold and unwavering. "Not enough." A beat of silence. Then the warlord grinned. The surviving crime lords, shaken but still breathing, watched the exchange with a mix of dread and fascination. There was something terrible unfolding here. Something they did not fully understand, but they could feel it. A shift. Kane did not tremble. He did not falter. He had killed the first wave, and he was ready to kill again. And for the first time in a long, long while, Gervec the Red, ruler of the Vorzul, self-proclaimed god of the underworld, was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake. Gervec's grin sharpened, revealing serrated teeth. He lifted a clawed hand, and before the last syllable of his command left his throat, the room exploded into motion. The surviving enforcers surged forward, their hesitation burned away by orders and instinct. Kane moved faster. The first enforcer lunged, plasma baton arcing in a downward slash. Kane sidestepped, twisting his body just enough to let the weapon cut air. He drove an elbow into the enforcer's throat, seized his wrist, and redirected the momentum, snapping the alien's own weapon across his skull with a crack that sent him crumpling. 2 more closed in. Kane ripped a fallen sidearm from the floor and fired once, twice, both shots striking home. The first took a plasma bolt to the eye, collapsing with a gurgled snarl. The second staggered, a smoldering hole in his abdomen. But Kane was already on him, wrenching the rifle from his hands and slamming the butt into his jaw. Teeth and blood spattered the floor. Another enforcer raised his rifle, but Kane was already moving. He dropped low, scooped up a fallen energy shield from a severed arm, and flung it forward. It struck like a thrown blade, the impact knocking the enforcer backward. Kane didn't let him recover. He closed the distance, grabbed the rifle as the alien fell, and squeezed the trigger. The enforcer hit the ground, motionless. The remaining guards faltered. Kane stood amidst the wreckage, rifle in hand, breathing steady. The syndicate lords, who had once lounged in self-assured decadence, now huddled near the walls, their eyes wide, their bodies tense with the instinct to flee, but knowing there was nowhere to run. Gervais remained unmoved. The warlord exhaled, shaking his head, not in fear but in something bordering on admiration. "I see it now," he mused. The Terran discipline, the quiet, methodical slaughter. He gestured at the bodies littering the hall, the blood pooling in fractured stone. "But you've made a mistake, human." Kane didn't speak. Gervais spread his arms. "You have killed my guards, but you have not killed me." The chamber doors groaned open. Heavy, metallic footsteps filled the air, a deeper, more deliberate rhythm than the previous enforcers. The walls hummed with power, automated defenses coming online. The station was waking up, sensing that the apex predator within it was no longer its master. Kane turned. From the open doorway, 5 figures entered, each standing nearly twice his height, their armored bodies plated in polished black, glowing runes carved into their limbs. Battle frames, the cartel's deadliest weapons. Cybernetic warlords who had long abandoned flesh in favor of machine, their organic remains encased in layers of reinforced alloys. The tallest of them, a towering figure with arms thick enough to crush a man's spine with a twitch, leveled his gaze at Kane through an emotionless, steel-plated face. "Designation." "Kane," it droned, its voice reverberating through the hall like a death knell. "Target confirmed," Gervais chuckled, stepping back into the shadows. "Now, human, let's see if you bleed." Kane exhaled. He tightened his grip on the rifle, calculating. His ammunition was low. His body ached, not from exhaustion, but from the unyielding demand of constant, perfect execution. His mind processed the angles, the distance, the weaponry his enemies carried. Then he moved. The first battle frame opened fire, twin plasma repeaters roaring to life. Kane was already diving, rolling into cover as the bolts scorched the floor behind him. The stone shattered, molten fragments spraying across the room. Kane snapped his rifle up, fired once, twice, both rounds striking the nearest battle frame's visor. The kinetic impact staggered the machine but did not stop it. Kane didn't expect it to. He was already moving. A second frame charged, servos whining as it closed the gap in a fraction of a second. Kane barely twisted aside as a massive metal fist obliterated the floor where he had stood. He seized the opening, driving a stolen combat knife between the seams of its plating, severing hydraulic lines. The machine staggered, sparks vomiting from the wound. No hesitation. Kane ripped the blade free and drove it upward into the machine's exposed throat plating. A violent shudder. The battle frame twitched, its body failing, before Kane wrenched the blade sideways. The head detached with a metallic snap, cables whipping like severed tendons. The machine fell, motionless. 3 left. The remaining battle frames adjusted, shifting into a more coordinated attack pattern. They weren't just machines. They were killers. Their programming adapted, their targeting systems recalibrating to account for his movement patterns. Kane narrowed his eyes. Good. One of them deployed a blade, a monomolecular edge humming with lethal energy. It lunged. Kane dodged, barely, the blade slicing through his sleeve, skin burning beneath the heat. The machine pressed the attack, each swing measured, each strike calculated to drive him into the second waiting frame's line of fire. Kane played along. At the last second, instead of evading, he pivoted toward the attack. The machine adjusted, anticipating a dodge, but Kane wasn't dodging. He caught the machine's wrist mid-strike, twisted his entire weight into it, and wrenched it sideways. The monomolecular blade skewered the second battle frame instead. The impaled machine spasmed, its systems failing, sparks bursting from its core. Kane didn't stop. He surged forward, using the first machine's momentum against it, driving it backward into a stone pillar. It struck hard, struggling, but Kane was already lifting its own blade. One clean motion. The machine's head split apart, sparks cascading as its body collapsed. Two left. Kane turned, breathing hard, blood dripping from his arm, his own pain pushed aside. The remaining battle frames hesitated, not in fear but in cold reassessment. Kane wasn't supposed to be alive. He wasn't supposed to be winning. Gervais watched, his smile fading into something unreadable. Kane lifted his stolen rifle, locking eyes with the warlord. The final two battle frames did not hesitate. Whatever sliver of self-preservation had existed in their programming was gone, overridden by their core directive: eliminate the threat. Kane barely had time to register the shift before they attacked in unison. One fired a shoulder-mounted plasma barrage, the air boiling with each concussive blast. The other advanced, its reinforced arms unfolding into segmented blades, a death machine honed for a singular purpose. Kane ran. The first explosion detonated behind him, a shockwave ripping through the hall. He lunged sideways, rolling behind the wreckage of a shattered pillar. Heat seared his back, but he had no time for pain. He rose, rifle snapping up, and fired 3 times. One shot went wide. The second pinged off reinforced armor. The third struck true, slamming into the exposed vent of the advancing frame's knee joint. It stumbled but did not fall. Kane didn't wait for it to recover. He closed the distance. The battle frame lashed out, blade arcing in a sweeping strike meant to bisect him. Kane dropped, the weapon hissing inches above his head. He surged forward, driving the muzzle of his rifle beneath its plating, and fired at point-blank range. The armor ruptured. The machine spasmed. The second battle frame seized the opening. A reinforced fist, dense as a starship hull, came down like a meteor. Kane barely twisted aside, the impact cratering the floor where he had stood. He pivoted, swinging his rifle up, only to find the barrel crushed in the machine's grip. It ripped the weapon from his hands and threw it aside. Kane exhaled, flexed his fingers, and drew his knife. The machine struck. Kane met it head-on. It was no longer a battle of speed or precision. It was brutality. The battle frame's blows were like hammer strikes, each one capable of turning bone to dust. Kane weaved between them, narrowly avoiding death with every movement. The knife flashed, slicing to expose cables, severing servos. Sparks flew. The battle frame staggered, adjusting its approach. Kane used the opening. He lunged, driving the knife into the gap beneath its jaw. The blade punched through, embedding deep in the machine's neural core. For a moment, nothing. Then the frame convulsed. Its body seized, locked in a violent tremor as systems collapsed. Kane yanked the blade free and kicked it backward. The machine fell, its glowing optics flickering once before fading to black. Silence. Kane straightened, blood and oil staining his hands. He turned. Gervais was already moving. The warlord had seen enough. He had watched Kane dismantle his empire's deadliest enforcers, had felt the cold certainty of an outcome he had never before considered. He was not a fool. He would not stay to die. The hidden exit behind his throne hissed open, the corridor beyond bathed in emergency lighting. He stepped back, talons flexing, a final sneer curling his lips. "You are impressive, human," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But you are still just a man." Kane took a step forward. Gervais took another back. Your kind fights with fury, but fury is not enough. You think this ends here? The warlord gestured to the carnage, the bodies, the ruins of a syndicate. This is nothing. The underworld does not die with me. 1,000 others will rise. You have changed nothing. Cain did not answer. He reached for his belt, pulled the last charge from his pack, and primed it. The device hummed, its timer flickering to life. Jervek's sneer faltered. You wouldn't? Cain tossed the charge. The warlord caught it on reflex. The realization hit an instant too late. The explosive latched onto his palm, its failsafe already engaged. Panic flashed in his crimson eyes. He scrambled, clawing at the device, trying to pry it free. His movements were sharp, desperate. A predator caught in a trap of its own making. Cain turned away. Behind him, Jervek let out a snarl, half rage, half fear. Then the charge detonated. A concussive blast ripped through the chamber, fire and shrapnel bursting outward. Cain kept walking. He did not look back. By the time the flames settled, the warlord of the underworld was gone. The station's alarms wailed, the structure shuddering as emergency failsafes engaged. Cain moved through the wreckage, past the smoldering remains of those who had ruled through fear. The corridors were empty now. Guards who had once stood proud had fled, cowards scurrying from a sinking ship. He reached the docking bay. His ship waited, engines humming, its dark hull gleaming beneath the station's flickering lights. Cain paused at the threshold, glancing back once. The syndicate was broken. The empire that had stolen, enslaved, and butchered had been reduced to burning ruins. But Jervek had not been wrong. The underworld would not die with him. Others would rise. Others always did. Cain stepped aboard, sealing the hatch behind him. Let them rise. He would be waiting,